Our focus today is social class. Our learning goals are to engage with concepts of social hierarchy that extend beyond income. We'll talk about various definitions of social class and status, and then we'll connect some of these ideas to data sources that you could potentially use in your final project. As a quick recap of what we did in our last discussion, we worked with data from the General Social Survey. In these data, survey respondents were asked, if you were asked to use one of four names for your social class, which would you say you belong in? The working class, the lower class, the working class, the middle class, or the upper class? We learned in discussion that almost all Americans identify with either the working class or the middle class. Basically, no one says lower class or upper class. We talked then about what we think of this measure of social class. There were some concerns that folks raised that these categories haven't really been defined. It's sort of whatever the respondent defines their working class to mean, or middle class to mean, affects how that respondent answers the question. So this leads me to ask you now in lecture, should we study social class? And if so, how would you define it? I think there's some value in these subjective definitions of social class, like that used on the General Social Survey. Today we'll engage with some other definitions of social class that are perhaps less subjective and more grounded in different definitions of what it would mean for someone to be of one class or another class. I think all these approaches are valuable. We'll start with class as ownership of capital. This is a view that traces back to Karl Marx. I'm going to take a Marxist lens here, and I want to be clear that I'm not advocating that we all become like the Soviet Union. We're engaging with Marx here as an economic theorist, not so much as like a political advocate. So under the Marxist view, capital, that's things that you own, they create a system of power relations. In Marx's view, classes are in conflict. We have a set of people who own capital, they own the means of production, and another set of people who don't. These two classes, they have opposing interests. The class of people who own the means of production, they make money at the expense of those who don't. And so concretely, these are the classes. There's the people who own the means of production. This is like the person who owns the factory. And then there's other people who don't own anything. This is the person making the widgets in the factory. These people can only sell their labor to the people in class 1. And so they're in a difficult place. Because of this, capitalists exploit the laborers. Now, by exploit, I don't mean a normatively loaded term here, but I just mean a technical definition of exploitation. Here we could ask ourselves, how much does the capitalist pay to the laborer for each hour of the laborer's work? Suppose that the laborer produces a good, and every hour that good produces enough profit for the capitalist that they can bring in $100 of profit. Do they hand this entire $100 on to the laborer with a $100 per hour hourly wage? Do they hand them $50, $20, $10? Marx has an answer to this question. He thinks that because the laborers own nothing, they are really stuck working for the capitalist will pay them only enough for the laborer to basically eat and survive. It's like a subsistence wage. And this is what Marx means by exploitation. The capitalist is exploiting the laborer because with an hour of their labor, that laborer produces a bunch of profit and a lot of it gets kept by the capitalist. So the capitalist keeps all the profit and hands on to the worker only what they need to help that worker survive to work another day. So how do we see this today? We could take a Marxist lens to look at social inequality today through a variety of approaches. Some of them might be to look at patterns of stock market returns that exceed growth. After all, we may not live in a world where everyone works in a factory or owns a factory, but we do live in a world where lots of people with assets, they own stocks. And without them working at all, those stocks are invested in a company. Laborers in that company produce profit. And some of that profit goes back to the stockholders who see their stock values rise. They've earned more money simply by owning capital. We could describe home values that rise faster than inflation. This is a case where some people own capital, their house, and their house goes up in value and they pocket the benefit. We could also describe the consolidation of capital in fewer hands. Questions about the distribution of assets across people and how that distribution gets consolidated where a bunch of the assets are held by only a few people could fit within a Marxist lens about inequality. So as one example of this, here's a graph from the Pew Research Center showing that the richest families are the only group to have gained wealth since the Great Recession. In class, we talked a little bit about what we like about this graph and what we think could improve. But in broad brushstrokes, this is the kind of graph you might produce in your final project. Here we see that in a time period in the 80s and 90s, it was folks at the bottom of the wealth distribution who saw their wealth rise the most. Whereas in 1998 to 2007, it was those at the top of the wealth distribution who saw the highest percentage gain in their wealth. And in the most recent period, highlighted by the title, it's only the high wealth group who saw an increase in wealth. Because this video is an abbreviation, I won't go forever explaining what's in the axes and in the graph along the way, but you could look into it yourself and see what you think about how these axes could be improved and how you think this story could be told clearly in a presentation. If you want to learn more, the roots of this way of thinking about class are in Karl Marx. One common present-day application of Marx is Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century, which really spurred a new set of research in economics and the social sciences that takes a Marxist lens to inequality, really focused on the ownership of assets. Now, you might say it would be great to go beyond two classes. After all, we do not live in a hypothetical industrial society where there's a set of people owning the factory and a set working in the factory. In fact, we live in a society where almost everyone has to labor to some degree in order to survive. So we might want to further disaggregate the laborers into additional classes. Eric Olin Wright was a class theorist who worked in sociology and developed some ways of thinking about class. Wright maintained the notion of class analysis as focused on people who are in different structural locations within the system of production and whose interests are opposed, producing conflict between those in different classes. Applying this idea, Wright proposed some frameworks for thinking about how the laborers can be further disaggregated into additional classes with different class locations. So one way to do that is to separate laborers by their authority over others and also by their possession of scarce skills. If we did that, we could come to a schema with many class categories. Here at the left, we have the owners, people who own the means of production. And at the right, we have the employees who don't own the means of production. This is sort of like the classic Marxist difference. But among the employees, we could have further divisions. After all, there are some folks who are managers, and they exert authority over others in the workplace. Similar to how an owner might exert authority over the workers, a manager might exert authority over those they work for, those who work for them. We could also arrange people along class map by their relation to scarce skills. After all, experts who possess scarce skills, they are harder to replace, so they are in a more powerful position in the economy because they have these skills which the owners really need in order for their businesses to survive. You can take this notion to make a variety of different class maps that consider how people are arranged in the economic system according to things like their authority and their relationship to scarce skills. This leads to questions like, how would you measure classes by ownership, authority, and skills? Many frameworks have been proposed. One common way to do this is to focus on occupations. Occupations are categories. There's several hundred of them defined by the census, and they're titles based on the tasks that people do at work. So various class theorists have proposed ways to take occupations and code those into a smaller number of discrete classes. One common coding is a system proposed by Erickson, Goldthorpe, and Portocarrero back in 1979. There are various versions of this coding today, one of which you're using on the homework that you're working on right now. This coding has several categories: higher grade professionals, lower grade professionals, routine non-manual workers, small proprietors, skilled manual, and unskilled manual workers. These different people, they exist with different amounts of status in the economy, different rates of income, different kinds of education necessary to get into that class, and different positions within power relations. Using this schema, you could describe things like what's differences in income across people in these different occupational classes. You could also describe social mobility across generations. In a working paper with Daniel Molitor and Jenny Brand, we have an example where we actually do this. So one of our figures describes the proportion of children to reach a given occupational class among those whose parents were in different occupational classes. This is the kind of result you could work on in your final project. After all we have here is survey data with information on parents and kids. And what we can conclude are some descriptive things. So if your parents were farmers, you have a 27% chance of becoming a professional. Whereas if your parents were professionals, you have a 51% chance of becoming a professional. Classes provide lots of opportunities to summarize discrete differences in people's life chances. If you want to learn more about class, you could go look at Eric Olin Wright's book. This is a link. The picture itself is a link to where you can get this book online through the Cornell Library. We might also want to know about classes and capital that is not financial. So maybe we shouldn't think about class in terms of people's ownership of assets or their structural position in the labor market, but rather in terms of the ownership of other kinds of capital. Bourdieu, in 1986, he was a French theorist, and he came up with this idea about various forms of capital. At a very high level, let's think about this with a concrete example. I possess knowledge of data science. Knowledge of data science, it's highly valued in the economy. And you can buy this knowledge with your tuition. In this example, we started with me possessing knowledge of data science. This is what Bourdieu calls embodied cultural capital. It's just something I have as a skill based on all of my training and my education. This knowledge is also institutionalized cultural capital in the sense that I have educational credentials showing that I've mastered some skills in data science. Second, I said that knowledge of data science is highly valued in the economy. You could imagine that if you picked me up and you dropped me back in the 1800s, would my knowledge of data science be very helpful? Not really. There wouldn't be computers, there wouldn't be troves of data. Knowing data science really wouldn't help you much in the 1800s. We could say here that the value of this knowledge of data science, it depends on the field in which it's deployed. It's very valuable in the field of the 21st century economy. It wouldn't be so valuable in the 1800s. Finally, I said that you can buy this knowledge with your tuition. This is an example of how forms of capital are fungible. You or your parents have invested some financial capital in your tuition dollars in the hopes of getting some cultural capital back. This is in knowledge of data science and also in institutionalized cultural capital through your educational credentials. Okay, so what does this whole thing about cultural capital have to do with social class? There are some theorists and social scientists who argue that classes can be understood partly in terms of their different access to forms of cultural capital. So we could think about questions of what kinds of cultural capital are valued, in what fields, and how is that cultural capital acquired? These kinds of questions could help us understand how some class positions of parents could be transmitted on to their children based on their knowledge and their ways of being that just come with their class position. One example of this is Annette Lareau's qualitative study in her book titled Unequal Childhoods. Lareau studied families in a suburban area around a northeastern city, and she followed these families around over time. She worked with black and white families and with those who were middle class and working class. She went with them to meetings at school, she went with them to the doctor, she saw the children playing together out in the street and in organized activities. And Lareau concluded that there were key differences in the styles of parenting used by the middle class parents and the working class parents. The first style she describes as concerted cultivation. In this kind of parenting, the parent actively fosters skills. As an example of this, she tells the story of one child who was going to the doctor, and on the way to the doctor, the mom says to the child, "Why don't you think about some questions you could ask the doctor?" In the meeting then with the doctor, the child goes ahead and asks a question that he had planned based on that conversation with his mom. Here the mom has fostered a skill of engaging with a person in positions of authority where that child knows to ask for things that they want. Another example of concerted cultivation is scheduled activities, where parents feel it's their responsibility to fill their child's day with activities to try to get them to develop skills that will be useful to them later. So broadly, concerted cultivation is a parenting style practiced by middle-class parents. Leroux noticed it's the parents who have college degrees and work in professional occupations who tend to have this kind of parenting style. She also noticed another parenting style that she calls the accomplishment of natural growth. Under this parenting style, the parents mostly let their children grow. The children have lots of autonomy in this style. They are taught to be deferential toward people in authority. They are given opportunities to go and design a new kickball game out on the street with the neighbors instead of being put in organized athletic activities. This was a parenting style that she found was commonly practiced by working class parents. And when you think about how these parenting styles have consequences for these children's outcomes, the field, the US education system and economy, it tends to reward concerted cultivation. Children who are trained to challenge authority and be assertive and fill their days with schedules, they are trained in a way that pays off in terms of moving ahead in the education and labor market of the United States. Now you can imagine this might not be the case in a different field. We could imagine an economy where people who have the independence to come up with activities for themselves tend to do really well financially. It's not the case that one parenting style is inherently better than the other parenting style, but it is the case that the concerted cultivation approach matches well with the kinds of things that are rewarded in the US economy. The reason I've gone down this side road about cultural capital is that it helps you see a different sense of what it means for people to occupy different class locations. In Leroux's framework, something that helps us think about what it means to be middle class and working class is sort of these ways of being that are transmitted from parents to kids through parenting. Now you might say, that's really interesting, and it's a qualitative project, but how on earth could this map to questions we could answer with data science? After all, it's really hard to measure things like how parents interact with kids using quantitative data. But actually, there have been some efforts to make this happen. So in one paper by Weininger, Leroux, and Conley, they actually looked at data on what parents and kids do with their time, and they looked at how often kids are involved in organized activities. And they showed that the minutes spent per day in organized activities was higher for kids whose parents had college degrees. The data source for this was time diaries. This is a data source where a surveyor goes to a family, perhaps on the phone or online, or it could be in person, and says to them, let's pick a certain day. Say it was February 7th. On that day, what were you doing at midnight? And then, of course, they'll say, well, I was sleeping at midnight. And then they say, well, what time did you wake up? And the person says, I woke up at 7:30 a.m. So they start filling out a diary. And they say, at 7:30, what were you doing? Well, I started making breakfast. How long were you making breakfast for? Till 7:45. And they do this for a full 24-hour period. This is something that you could study in your final project. The American Time Use Study is a really easy-to-use time diary study that's available through IPAMS, and this link will take you there. And if you wanted, you could look at how people use the minutes of their day, perhaps differently for those in different class locations. The last topic I want to discuss today is status. Here we're sort of cramming lots of different kinds of hierarchy that are not income all into one day with the hope that if some of you want to, you could explore some of the things more in your final project. So what is status? Imagine that you are at a party. And when you're at a party, you walk up to someone you don't know, and what's the first thing you say? Hi, what do you do? And people often do this. They jump into like what they do for work as a first way of knowing kind of what's someone's life like. So at the party, you say to someone, well, what do you do? And person A says, oh, I'm a medical doctor. And you might think, oh, wow, that's a very prestigious occupation. Now person B comes along, and you say, well, hi, what do you do? And they say, I'm a very skilled gambler. Now this elicits a very different response. You might automatically have some respect and honor given to the medical doctor that you might not feel so much for the very skilled gambler. And you might think to yourself, why is this that I think differently about the doctor and the gambler, and how could I measure that kind of difference? After all, this may not be a difference in income. It's possible that the gambler is really, really good, and maybe that skilled gambler's income is actually the same as the income of a medical doctor. But somehow the status of the medical doctor is higher. This is what we mean by status, which is a concept that goes back to Max Weber and has been measured in various ways through data science efforts over the past few decades. So carrying on with this example, we might think about occupations conferring status on people. So each occupation might have some typical income and some typical amount of status. The skilled gambler is an example of an occupation that might be high income but fairly low in status, whereas the medical doctor is high income and high in status. You could imagine other occupations that hold different positions within this map. Public school teachers, for instance, are working in a very honorable profession that people might think of as high status. But it has comparably low income. We know that public school teachers are not paid that well compared to others with their similar educational credentials. There are also occupations that are both low income and low status, like fast food worker. So if you want to look at a research project about how people are arranged along some hierarchy, you may not just want to think of income as your outcome, but you could also think of occupational status as your outcome. So how exactly would that be measured? In an example in the 2012 General Social Survey, the respondents were given 90 occupations on paper cards, and these respondents were asked, please put the card in the box at the top of the ladder if you think that occupation has the highest possible social standing. Put it at the bottom of the ladder if you think it has the lowest social standing. So respondents rated occupations from low social standing to high social standing. Researchers then aggregated these ratings in order to give each occupation a score for its prestige. Scores like these have been created in various ways and are often available in data sets that are accessible to you, like the General Social Survey, as well as some of the data sets provided by IPUMS. So if you want to ask a question where you want to look not just at difference in income as your outcome variable, you could look at differences in occupational status. We went through a lot of topics today. We engaged with various concepts of social hierarchy beyond income. We started with a Marxist lens which focused on social class defined by ownership of capital. If you wanted to pursue a project through this lens, you might take assets to be your outcome variable, or you might look at subgroups of people with various amounts of assets and see how they convert those assets into income, for instance, in the stock market. We then considered social class as defined by authority and skills. We considered how there might be a small number of discrete classes in the US and in other countries, and we might think about how those classes are transmitted across generations and related to other outcomes about which we might care. We then discussed cultural capital. This is a concept that is famously difficult to measure in quantitative data because it's about the skills and sort of the ways of being that we have that might sort us into different class positions. We talked about how you could measure cultural capital with some data sources, such as a time use study. Finally, we talked about status hierarchies. Perhaps instead of looking at differences in income, we might look at inequality in status defined by, for instance, people's occupations and how others think about the status of those occupations. Throughout, the overall goal today was to connect all of these ideas to data sources, because the ultimate goal is to sprinkle ideas over you in this class so that you can then go consider various data sources you might use to answer interesting new questions about inequality.